Hello YouTube. Today we're going to examine an issue in the philosophy of photography known as the transparency thesis, which was proposed by Kendall Walton in his article Transparent Pictures. We can begin with the point that photography seems to be an especially realistic medium. Walton's initial problem was to explain this, to explain why it is that photography tends to be seen as the most realistic art. Now, one element of realism is rather obvious. Photographs, at least when done in the right kind of way, are the culmination of the sort of Renaissance ideal of realism, where this is the attempt to depict a particular subject as truthfully as possible, without any stylization or artistic conventions or anything like that. Realism in this sense is art as a mirror of nature. You put on the canvas just what you see with your eyes, nothing more and nothing less. We can call this style realism, and this is the sense in which this painting is more realistic than this painting. That's Vermeer and that's Francis Bacon. Now, obviously, photography can offer a maximum amount of style realism. If you take any standard photograph, even a photograph that you take with a cheap camera, will be more style realistic than what most painters could achieve. But style realism can't be the whole story. Many photographs are less style realistic than even relatively abstract paintings. But even a fuzzy, distorted, manipulated photograph seems to have a high degree of realism in some sense. Perhaps more so even than a painting like the Vermeer that is very style realistic. So, I mean, again, recall that Vermeer painting. Well, here's the earliest surviving photograph. It's not immediately clear what this photo even shows. It's actually a view out of a window in France. I think this was taken in the 1830s. Now, in terms of style, the Vermeer painting is clearly more realistic than the photograph. And yet this photograph seems to provide some special connection with the world. It seems to provide a connection that we don't get with the painting. Walton gives the example of Goya's painting, Disasters of War. Goya's drawings, rather, Disasters of War. This shows a number of dead bodies in the war. And you can compare this with Timothy O'Sullivan's photos of dead bodies from the battlefield during the American Civil War. I won't show those photos because I'm not sure what the YouTube policy is on depictions of dead bodies, but you can Google them. And now, even if you find Goya's drawings to be aesthetically better or to be more emotionally moving or whatever, there does seem to be some sense in which Sullivan's photographs provide a deeper connection to war. It seems to provide a deeper connection to reality. Now, Walton suggests that this kind of realism is explained by what he calls the transparency of photography. This is the claim that when we look at a photograph, we directly see the objects and events depicted. We see through the photograph to the events themselves. When you look at that early photograph of the view from the window, you are literally seeing out that window. So, as Walton says, photographs are transparent. We see the world through them. Walton clarifies that he means this literally. He says, and I quote, "I am not saying that the person looking at the dusty photographs has the impression of seeing his ancestors. I am not saying that photography supplements vision by helping us to discover things we can't discover by seeing. My claim is that we see, quite literally, our dead relatives themselves when we look at photographs of them." So photographs are not just pictures. They literally extend the power of sight. When you look at a photograph of Abraham Lincoln, you see Abraham Lincoln. You don't just see a representation of Lincoln, you literally see Lincoln himself. The realism of photography consists partially in its transparency. Even when photographs are highly stylized, they are still transparent. We still see through them to the objects depicted. Here is an interesting photograph of a girl called Amy. I say it's interesting because it's actually not a photograph at all. This is an oil painting by David Eichenberg. When we discover that this is a painting, the experience sort of jolts us. And it's not the same as For example, discovering that what we thought was an etching is actually a pen and ink drawing. Or when we discover that what we thought was a completely 2D painting has certain 3D elements. And the jolt as well isn't produced just by the realisation of the great skill that must have been involved in creating this. There are plenty of artworks that require great skill that don't jolt us in the same way. Instead, according to Walton, the discovery jolts us because we suddenly feel less in contact with Amy. It's more like the jolt of an optical illusion. When you sort of view a particular illusion, a colour illusion, for instance, and there's maybe two colours that look completely different, but you discover that they're exactly the same. It's like that. Now, on Walton's view, this painting literally is an illusion. It seems as though we are seeing Amy via the medium of photography, but in fact, we are only seeing a representation of Amy, and it's that discovery that produces the sort of jolt. When we learn that it's a painting, it jolts us because we realise that we're actually looking at an illusion. So that's Walton's thesis. Now, one thing we need to clarify is that obviously Walton would admit that seeing something through a photograph is not the same as seeing it directly. Similarly, seeing an object through water is not the same as seeing it through air. Seeing something through a distorting mirror or a distorting lens is not the same as seeing it directly. But the point is that when you look at an object through water, you see the object. You are in some sense really in contact with the object. And Walton claims that the same is true for photographs. When you see something through a photograph, you really are in contact with it. So, what are Walton's arguments for the transparency thesis? Well, first of all, Walton offers a slippery slope argument. He begins by pointing out that nobody has any problem with the claim that we see through eyeglasses, or that we see through distorting lenses. For instance, you might have a fisheye lens or something. If you put a fisheye lens on the glasses, that will distort things. You still see through then. We see through mirrors. We see through microscopes and telescopes. And Walton then suggests that given all of this, there seems to be no reason to deny that, for example, when fans of a football team watch a live broadcast, they see the football team. A telescope extends your power of sight to objects that are otherwise too far away to be seen. A live broadcast, Walton thinks, is exactly the same. It extends your power of sight to objects that otherwise you wouldn't be able to see. But then given this, there seems little reason to deny that you can see the football team whenever you watch a delayed broadcast of them. And that's all Walton needs for his conclusion. The only difference between a photograph and a delayed broadcast is that the photo is a single frame. Let me make a couple of comments on this argument. First of all, slippery slope arguments are, in general, they are fallacies. Walton explicitly calls this a slippery slope argument, but I think a more charitable interpretation is that he's offering a challenge. So the challenge is that it's basically like, look, you're happy to say that we see through mirrors, microscopes and telescopes. So if we claim that we don't see through photographs, then we need to point to some relevant difference between photographs and these other instruments. Walton thinks that there is no difference. I actually think there is, and a bit later in this video I'll explain what I take that difference to be. But for now we can note that if we agree with Walton that there is no relevant difference between photos and these other instruments that extend perception, then that does lend some support to Walton's conclusion. A second point, however, is that even granting the assumption that there's no relevant difference, Walton's conclusion doesn't immediately follow, because we could hold that actually we don't see through eyeglasses, mirrors, microscopes or telescopes. We might insist that perception can only ever be totally direct. If you view an object through an instrument, you're not seeing the object itself, but only a picture created by the instrument. People who are inclined towards, for instance, scientific anti-realism would claim that the images created by microscopes and maybe even telescopes aren't even veridical. The microscope seems to show a bacterium, the telescope seems to show a quasar, but actually there are no bacteria or quasars. I recommend checking out my series on scientific anti-realism if you're interested. In particular, part 6 of the series is concerned with observation in science, and that may be worth checking out if you're interested in this. Of course, there are problems with holding the extreme view that we don't see through even glasses or mirrors, for example. Presumably the motivation for such a view is that perception must be causally direct. But on this assumption, it's difficult to explain perception at all. After all, when you look at an object, this involves light waves being reflected off the object, which then produces a certain pattern of activation of rods and cones in the retina, which then produces activation in ganglion cells, which eventually sends information down the optic nerve, and so on. If we insist that perception must be causally direct, then when I look at a cup, presumably I don't see the cup. Instead I see light waves, or I see activation of retinal cells, or whatever. I think that's a fairly absurd view. I mean, surely light waves and retinal cells are the means by which we perceive things, not the things we perceive. I mean, it would be difficult, I think, to hold the extreme view that we don't see through glasses or mirrors. But I just note that is a line we might take to object to Walton's argument. Walton's main argument rests on the claim that what is important for perception is a certain kind of mechanical connection. Photography is mechanical in the relevant sense. So Walton's idea here is that even the most realistic paintings and drawings show the world only as mediated by the beliefs of the artist. So consider a photograph of a jungle and an artist's sketch of a jungle. As Walton says, in the case of the drawing, I quote, he says, "The drawings indicate to us what was in the jungle by indicating what the artist thought was there." So we trust the drawings only insofar as we trust the judgment of the artist. On the other hand, we don't need to rely on the photographer's judgment. Of course, we might need to rely on the assumption that the photographer isn't trying to deceive us, because photos can be doctored, but assuming that the artist is trying to depict things accurately, we have to trust the painter's judgment, whereas we don't have to consider the photographer's judgment. A photograph of an object gives us a purely mechanical connection to that object. It's a connection that hasn't been mediated by a human mind. The photograph does require a human in the sense that a human needs to perform the actions required to make the photograph, but the photograph shows whatever was actually there. If you point the camera and click it in the right way, then the photo will show whatever was in fact, whatever the camera was in fact pointing at. So for a photograph, I mean, we can make a counterfactual claim. Let's say that the photo shows some object X. Well, then we can say, if X hadn't been there, a depiction of X wouldn't have been in the photograph. Now, the same is true of paintings and drawings as well. If a painter is painting a particular scene, let's say he's painting a jungle, then we can say that if a particular tree depicted in the painting hadn't been there, then the tree would not have been depicted in the painting, because the painter wouldn't have painted it. But there's an important distinction here, which is that a difference in the scene would have made a difference in the painting only by making a difference in the artist's beliefs about the scene. If the tree hadn't been there, it would not have been depicted in the painting only because the artist wouldn't have believed there was a tree there. On the other hand, a difference in the scene makes a difference in the photograph, no matter what the artist's beliefs are. So the objects shown in the photograph bypass the photographer and connect directly to the viewer. As Walton says, photographs are counterfactually dependent on the photographed scene, even if the beliefs of the photographer are held fixed. Paintings which have a counterfactual dependence on the scene portrayed lose it when the beliefs of the painter are held fixed. Or in other words, consider a photographer taking a photo of a jungle. He's in a perfectly fit state of mind and he just sees some nice looking trees. He takes the shot and the photograph shows the nice trees. Consider an artist painting a jungle. Again, he sees exactly what's there, some nice trees. He does his painting, and like the photograph, it depicts some nice trees. Now suppose the photographer had different beliefs. Suppose he was hallucinating and he believed he saw a dinosaur. Or the photo would show the same thing as it would in the first case. It would show some trees and no dinosaur. When he develops the photo, he's in for disappointment. On the other hand, if the painter is hallucinating, then his painting will be different. It will show what he believed he saw. It will show a dinosaur. Counterfactual dependence in the case of painting is mediated by the beliefs of the artist. Paintings show only what the artist believes he sees. This is not the case for photography. Photographs show what is there regardless of the beliefs. So photography is transparent. We see through photographs, but not through paintings or drawings, because photographs are purely mechanical. They're not mediated by beliefs. Now this, of course, raises a question: are there opaque photographs? Are there photographs that we don't see through? Yes. For an obvious example, consider exposing photographic paper dot by dot with a light to manually create an image. That would obviously be opaque. That would just be drawing with light. Even if the image looked very realistic, as with the David Eichenberg painting of Amy, that would only be a representation. Some photos are partially opaque and partially transparent. Photos can be doctored to show completely fictitious events. We don't see those events, but we do see the parts used to construct those events, the parts that haven't been faked. In this photograph, we think we see Ulysses S. Grant sitting on horseback in front of Civil War troops. In fact, this event never took place. This is a composite of 3 different images. One for Grant's face, another of a person sitting on horseback, and another for the background showing the troops. Obviously, we don't see the event depicted here. The event never happened. But we do see Grant's face. We see the horse and the body of the person sitting on the horse. We see the tents, we see the troops, and so on. Perhaps some photographs are manipulated so much that we can't be said to see anything in them. Here's a photograph by Henry Holmes Smith, an abstract photographer who used various special techniques to create images that sort of focused on the play of light and colour. I'm not sure we see anything here, although maybe we do. I suppose it depends on how exactly he created this image, but it's certainly difficult to make any sense of it. Here's a photo by me. I made this and then manipulated it extensively to the point that there's really nothing left of the original image. I don't think we can see anything here other than the photo itself. So there are several objections to transparency. First of all, we might point out that perception involves objects that currently exist. We perceive the present, whereas photos depict the past, sometimes hundreds of years in the past. There are many photos of dead people, such as Abraham Lincoln. Walton says that we see through the photo to see Lincoln himself. But how can that be possible? Lincoln doesn't even exist anymore. I think this objection is pretty weak. Just look at the night sky. When you look at stars, you are seeing them as they were thousands or millions of years ago. Some of them almost certainly no longer exist. Perhaps Betelgeuse went supernova 600 years ago. Since it's only 640 light years away, we won't perceive that supernova event for another 40 years. And in fact, in general, I mean, all perceptions show objects as they were in the past. It's just that usually it only shows them nanoseconds in the past because light is so fast. But I think it's clearly no objection to the transparency thesis that photographs show the past. I mean, Walton should just say that, look, we can perceive the past, which we can. A second objection is that photos distort. So by various means, photographers can distort colours and distort shapes. And even when photographers try to capture the world totally faithfully, there will still be some distortion. A fast-moving object will become a blur. Obviously, it's not really a blur. I mean, even in the most realistic photograph, there are going to be respects in which the photo doesn't look like the scene. There will be respects in which it distorts how the scene really was, so that the experience of seeing the photograph is not like the experience of seeing the actual scene. Again, I think this is quite a weak argument. Distortion occurs in many other perceptual contexts, when we see an object through fog, or through a fisheye lens, or through an out-of-focus microscope. Indeed, even perception that is completely natural, the perception that is totally unaided by instruments, is subject to distortion, as in optical illusions. This is the Ebbinghaus illusion. The orange dot on the left appears smaller than the orange dot on the right. They are exactly the same size. In the cafe wall illusion, the horizontal lines appear to be sloped, although they're actually perfectly parallel. So I think that this objection simply conflates the two senses of realism that we distinguished earlier. There are ways in which photos are not sort of style realistic. They distort things, but that certainly doesn't mean that we don't see through photographs. However, that's not quite the whole story. The critic of transparency might counter this by saying that there's a relevant difference between distortion of photos and distortion in perception in general. Recall that Walton's primary argument for transparency rested on the claim that photographs are not mediated by the beliefs of the photographer. Well, the problem is that the distortions in photographs are often active choices by the photographer. So there's a sense in which what we see in the photograph is mediated by the photographer's beliefs. An excellent example of this is provided by astrophotography. Consider photos of the surface of Mars. The cameras of Mars rovers are equipped with various different filters, and these filters make sort of different aspects of the scene salient. Once photographs are sent back to Earth, they must then be calibrated and processed. So you have the filtering to bring out different aspects of the scene, then the photos are sent to Earth, they're calibrated, they're processed, and all of this is with the goal of highlighting different parts of the soil or rocks or dust or atmosphere that are of interest to the researchers. Janet Vertisi has a great book called Seeing Like a Rover, which explores the really extensive amount of manipulation that any image of Mars will undergo. So we rarely ever see Mars as it would look to a human eye. This is not how Mars would look to the human eye if we were there. This has been actually quite extensively manipulated to look like that. The same is true of photos of nebula. Here's a lovely recent photo of the Bubble Nebula. If we were looking at this with our eyes, if we were sort of this close, as it were, looking with our eyes, it wouldn't look anything like this. Nebula photos often involve very long exposure times. Often the exposure will last for many hours to capture light that is far too faint for us to see. Furthermore, they will capture light in the ultraviolet and infrared parts of the spectrum, which humans can't perceive, and then they will convert that into visible colours. So here's a photo of the Horsehead Nebula that captured only infrared light. So obviously, we wouldn't we don't see infrared light. This infrared light is being converted to visible. This famous image uses visible light but is enhanced colour. This is the Cat's Eye Nebula. This image is constructed from visible light emitted by hydrogen atoms, oxygen atoms and nitrogen ions. Now, these all correspond to slightly different shades of red light. So in this image, it's the colour is enhanced. The hydrogen is shown in red, the oxygen is shown in blue, and the nitrogen shown in green. But that's not how it would look in reality. Even when space photos are presented in true colour, as you might say, so that they're presented to simulate what our eyes might see if we were to visit the objects, this is only the result of a great deal of manipulation of the images. These days it's very rare that an astrophotographer will simply point a camera at an object and take a snapshot. Various different shots will be taken and combined in different ways. The important thing to note here is that this is all based on the beliefs and intentions of the photographers and researchers. Even for apparently true colour images, the photographers have to assume a certain amount of background scientific knowledge. And after all, we can't actually send a person out, this close to the Cat's Eye Nebula to check that this is how it would actually look. We can't send them out to the Bubble Nebula to check how it would look. So there's a lot of a sort of assumed knowledge and assumed beliefs. Now, I think all of this is certainly important to keep in mind when we look at photos, but I think Walton has a plausible response. This is that we see some of the things depicted in the photos, but not others. So when we look at the Cat's Eye Nebula, at this image, we don't see these red clouds, because we wouldn't see red clouds if we were looking at it through a telescope. But we do see the sort of general shapes, okay, the kind of general shapes of the clouds, the shape of the nebula. And we do see this bright spot in the middle. In the photo of the Horsehead Nebula, again, we don't see the colours, but we do see the general shapes. Really, this is no different to looking at a black and white photo. In this photo of Abraham Lincoln, you're not seeing Abraham Lincoln's grey skin. He didn't have grey skin, but you are still seeing Lincoln. In general, things can appear to have properties that they don't really have. That's no obstacle to saying that we perceive those things. When we place a stick in water, it appears bent. We're not seeing a bent stick. We can't be seeing a bent stick because there is no bent stick, but we are seeing a stick. So I think Walton has a plausible response to this second argument. Okay, a third argument, which I think has a bit more bite, is that it is sort of concerned with how perception actually works in normal circumstances. Light is essential to the means of visual perception. We see things by detecting the light emitted or reflected or transmitted by them. Now, I should note there maybe are some exceptions to this. Consider shadows, holes, silhouettes. Arguably, we don't see shadows by detecting the light from them, rather shadows are absences of light. And a hole in the donut is, arguably not seen by detecting light from the hole, rather you detect light reflected by objects behind the donut. If you're interested in these questions, you should check out Roy Sorensen's book, Seeing Dark Things. It talks about these holes and shadows and stuff. So I make 2 points here. First, entities such as holes and shadows are, in general, metaphysically puzzling. They pose quite general problems for any theory of objects. Do holes exist? It looks like holes are just absences of matter, but how can an absence of matter be said to literally exist? And so on. It's obvious enough that these kinds of questions don't arise for photographs. Photographs are perfectly standard material objects, so we should expect that perception works normally with photographs. A second point is that even the perception of holes, shadows and silhouettes will probably have to be explained in terms of light. If we say that perceiving a shadow involves somehow perceiving an absence of light, we're still appealing to light in our explanation. So my general point here is light is essential to visual perception, and I would say that's still the case even if it operates in a somewhat deviant way with shadows and other entities like that. So light is, we sort of in general we detect things by detecting light. So let's say that I see the tree by detecting light reflected by the tree. To put it in a very simplified way, the light hits the tree, it is reflected, some of it is absorbed by the tree, but some of it is reflected, and some of that ultimately hits my retina, and I see the tree. Now notice that this general picture is also true for what we see through telescopes and optical microscopes. The telescope and the optical microscope use lenses to magnify the image, but ultimately the photons reaching your eyes are the photons emitted by the star or reflected off the bacterium. So it seems to make some sense to view telescopes and optical microscopes as ways of extending our vision. When you view Mars through a telescope, the telescope manipulates the light, but the light that hits your eye is the same light that was reflected off Mars. This is not the case for photography. When you look at a photograph of Mars, you're not detecting light that has been reflected off Mars. If you look at the photo on a computer screen, you're detecting light that has been emitted by your computer screen. If you print the photo and look at it outside, you're detecting light emitted by the sun and reflected off the paper. Recall Walton's slippery slope argument. We see through glasses, mirrors, microscopes and telescopes. Walton then suggests that there's no reason to deny that when you watch a live broadcast of a football game, you see through the television to the game. But I think this is wrong. When you watch a live broadcast, you're detecting light emitted by the television screen. And that's fundamentally different to viewing an object through glasses or a mirror or a telescope. So Walton's slippery slope isn't actually all that slippery. Basically, the claim is this. A necessary condition of perceiving an object X is that you can, as it were, trace back the photons that hit your eyes to being emitted or reflected or transmitted by X. Perhaps the same light waves allow us to see two objects at the same time. Let's say I look at a mirror and I would say I see the mirror. This claim might be true because I'm detecting light that has been reflected off the mirror. I also say that I see myself in the mirror, and this can also be true. Some of the light that was reflected off the mirror was earlier reflected off of me. I see both myself and the mirror. Now note that this is not a necessary, a sufficient. This is a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition. Sorry, let me say that again. This is a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition. Your retina is currently detecting photons that have been transmitted through air, but it would certainly be odd to say that you can see air. Air is invisible. Or to take the mirror example again, the light that was reflected off the mirror, and it was earlier reflected off of me, but we can trace it further back. The light was ultimately emitted by the sun. Presumably I don't see the sun when I look at myself in a mirror. So the condition that I've suggested here is only a necessary condition. If the condition doesn't hold for some X, then you don't visually perceive X. If it does hold, then you might perceive X, but you might not. There are presumably other necessary conditions, and these would rule out perceiving air or perceiving the sun when I look at a mirror. For the purposes of this video, we don't really need to explore what these other requirements for perception might be. The point is that if we accept this as a necessary condition, then it entails that photographs are not transparent. So this objection then is about the causal chains involved in perception. There just aren't the right kinds of causal chains for the objects depicted in photos. You can't see through a photo like you can see through a lens or through a mirror. And I think that seems to me to have some bite. Okay, so the previous objection was that the transparency thesis rests on a faulty account of perception. A fourth objection also appeals to the nature of perception, although in a rather different way. In recent years, so-called inactive accounts of perception have been picking up some steam. I'll briefly outline this theory here, although I don't really have enough. It would take a whole series to go into proper detail. So we usually think of perception as something that happens in the brain. We open our eyes, and the eyes receive information from the world in the form of wavelengths of light, which create patterns of activation of cells on the retina. This information is sent to the brain, where the brain constructs an internal representation of the world. This internal representation is then used as a map for actions. So we have a kind of three-stage model, where you have the perceptual input through the eyes, and then you have the internal processing on that input, and then you have action as an output. All three stages are sort of separable, as it were. On the inactive account of perception and action are intertwined. Perception arises through the interaction between the organism and its environment. The point of perception is to enable action. Learning to perceive requires relating your raw sensations to your bodily abilities. So, becoming aware that you can perform certain actions. You learn that a ball is graspable or bounceable. You learn that a door is openable. Perception necessarily involves sensory motor knowledge, which is the anticipation of the effects of bodily movement on your sensations. When you look at a horizontal line, this traces a certain kind of arc on the retina. If you move your eyes up or down, the curvature of the line on the retina will change. We know that an object becomes larger as we approach, that its apparent angles will change in standard ways as we move around it. We know how an object will feel as we pick it up. We know how our movement will cause one object to occlude another. We spontaneously turn our heads or squint or crane our necks to better make out features of interest in an object. All of this is fundamentally bodily. It's concerned with bodily movement. It's closely related to J.J. Gibson's idea that we perceive affordances. So Gibson says the affordances of the environment are what it offers the animal, what it provides or furnishes, either for good or ill. So when you look at a wine glass, you perceive it as something that you can knock over or pick up or lick or tap or whatever. If you pick it up, you will automatically apply just the right kind of pressure in your grip, not too much to shatter it, not so little that you drop it. You see the wine glass as offering all of these possibilities. Affordances are opportunities for behaviour. They're kind of relational properties. They're features of the way the animal interacts with the environment. So we perceive the world as affording certain possibilities for action. Alva Noah, one of the primary exponents of the enactive view, puts it this way. He says, "Perceiving is a way of acting. Perception is something we do. The world makes itself available to the perceiver through physical movement and interaction. Perception takes place not merely in the brain, but in the interaction between the organism and the environment." So here's a puzzle about perception. When you look at a penny at an angle, it somehow both looks like an ellipse and looks round. It's tempting to say that the penny appears like an ellipse, and we infer that it's round based on our knowledge of geometry. We have we have the perceptual input. When we look at the penny, the perceptual input, we create an internal representation of an ellipse, and we infer that the actual object is round because we know the sort of geometrical relations. But on the other hand, this doesn't sort of seem quite right. It's not just that we know that the penny is round as a result of reasoning. That the penny immediately appears round. We immediately see that the penny is round. In a sense, we can sort of see it in both ways. We see it both as an ellipse and as round. Now, according to enactivism, this is because seeing the penny involves knowing how the penny would look were we to move around it. We experience the shape of an object by understanding how our sensations would change were we to move. So seeing involves more than the visual sensations. It involves the bodily movement and the knowledge of how the bodily movement will alter the way our sensations of an object appear. I'll note just a couple of lines of evidence for enactivism. First, a number of studies have been made of people's judgments of the gradient of hills. So you put people in front of a hill, and then you give them a tilt board that they can adjust with their hand, and you ask them to match the gradient of the tilt board to the gradient of the hill. Interestingly, people will judge a hill to be steeper if they are tired or if they're carrying a heavy rucksack. Basically, the greater the physical difficulty in climbing the hill, the steeper you'll judge the hill to be. So this might suggest that you don't simply perceive the hill, you perceive the possibilities for action that the hill affords. And obviously those possibilities of action will be affected by your physical state. The second line of evidence comes from what Alva Noah calls experiential blindness. This occurs when a person has the right visual sensations but can't be said to perceive. Noah cites the example of people who were blind due to cataracts, who after having the cataracts removed woke up to visual sensations, but they could make absolutely no sense of them. Oliver Sacks describes one patient's experience as there was light, there was movement, there was colour, all mixed up, all meaningless, a blur. Only as the patient learns to relate the chaos of their visual sensations to their bodily movements do they become able to see and perceive. Initially, the patients have visual sensations. They receive information from their retinas, but that information is just incomprehensible because they're not initially able to understand how movement alters sensations. Okay, so that's enactivism. I haven't really explored it in much detail. I recommend Alva Noah's book Action in Perception if you want to learn more about this view. But what does all of this have to do with transparency? Well, the point is, when we look at, for example, a photograph of a ball, there's no possibility of picking up or kicking or bouncing the ball. If we move around the photograph, the ball won't change in the way that actual balls do. It will just sort of become, it's just flat. So it won't change its perceived shape in the way a real ball does. If we go completely around the photograph, we won't see the back of the ball, we'll just see the back of the photograph paper. And we know all of this. In terms of our bodily movements, we never treat photographs as anything other than pieces of paper. That's how we interact with photos. When we pick them up and when we manipulate them, we treat them as pieces of paper. So a photo of a ball is treated as a piece of paper. We don't treat it in the way that we would treat a ball. But on the inactive view, it would therefore seem that we don't see through photographs, because we don't perceive the photo as affording the same possibilities for action that an actual ball would. It's worth noting, incidentally, that on inactive accounts, presumably we don't see through telescopes or microscopes either. I mean, just as we can't manipulate a ball in a photograph, similarly we can't manipulate objects seen through telescopes. As with respect to microscopes, we are able to manipulate the objects seen in some ways. It just requires special instruments to do so. But certainly we can't interact with a bacterium or an egg cell in the way that we can interact with macroscopic objects. But anyway, I mean, it's clear enough that the inactive view of perception does seem to entail that photos are opaque. So I think, transparency, there are some problems with it. So if we reject transparency, to return to the question we began with, I mean, how do we explain the residual feeling that in some sense even a highly stylized photograph is more realistic or gives us more of a connection with the world than a very, very realistic painting like the David Eichenberg painting of Amy? Well, I would say, why would we need transparency to explain this? I mean, in Walton's argument, the points he made regarding counterfactuals and the mechanical nature of the photographic process, that's all true. And it seems to me that that's enough to explain why we seem to have this special connection with the world, why photographs offer this special connection with the world. It's not clear to me that we need to go further and claim that photographs are transparent in the way that Walton does. So anyway, that's transparency. I hope you found that interesting, and goodbye.